Okay, so welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us again this evening for another talk with the Art Deco Society UK. Can't believe it's June webinar already. I'm Ruthie Good. I'm the events coordinator for the Art Deco Society UK, as you may know. And I'm looking forward to introducing our speaker, Peter Forsaith. But first, I need to run through the usual reminders. So, firstly, for auto-generated captions during the webinar, please click on CC Live Transcription at the bottom of your screen and then show subtitles. A quick reminder as well that this is the Zoom webinar format, so it's different from a normal Zoom meeting. No one can hear you or see you, including me or Peter. So please just sit back and relax. And we'll follow tonight's presentation as usual with a question and answer session with our speaker, Peter. So if you have any questions for him, just type them in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. You can also use the chat function to share any comments and thoughts. Please remember to be respectful with your questions and comments, as you always are. And I'll put all your comments and questions to Peter at the end. Lastly, if you have any issues with sound or video, please use the chat function again to flag these up, and we'll do our very best to resolve these behind the scenes. So that's the ground rules over with, and now I'll be introducing tonight's speaker, Peter Forsaith. Peter is a research affiliate at Oxford Brookes University, and he's lectured in Britain, Europe and America, and his publications include books, chapters and journal articles. His focal historical specialisms have been in culture, religion and society in the 18th century and early 19th century Britain. From 1995, Peter worked on the Westminster College campus, Oxford, which was designed in the late 1950s by Seeley and Paget. This was arguably their largest single commission, and as a result, Peter has extended his research to cover Seeley and Paget and their buildings at a time when interest in them is growing. Peter's given various talks about Seeley and Paget, and he's published a series of biannual newsletters about them in conjunction with English Heritage. Peter's talk for us this evening is called Modern But Without Affectation, Seeley and Paget in the 1930s. Seeley and Paget started the 30s as a young and inexperienced architectural partnership, but by the end of the decade, they were an established and respected practice. So now it's time to hand over to Peter for what promises to be a very engaging talk. Thank you, Peter. Just take it away.
Thank you very much indeed, Ruthie. Trust you can hear me loud and clear. Good. And thank you very much indeed for inviting me and facilitating all this. And thank you for handling the crisis with the PowerPoint. Why we don't, anyway, there we are. Let's just get on. And another thank you to Esme, who I think will be listening, for using quite a lot of her photographs as we go along. So to introduce them, to say, and this is really to say what was on the blurb for this evening. It is perverse that the three buildings by which Seeley and Paget are often known all date from the 30s, but are arguably unrepresentative of their work. The Shack, Eltham Palace and Templewood were all somewhat idiosyncratic buildings for various reasons I'll go into. So in this talk, I want to look at their 1930s work as a whole, firstly looking at those three buildings. Well, first of all, give a bit of background, and then looking at those three buildings, and then look at the rest of their work through the 30s, or take an overview of it, and suggest that other buildings are much more representative of their output, so that judging Seeley and Paget often adversely by three maverick buildings is misdirected. You can see if you agree. Some of you will know quite a bit about Seeley and Paget, their architectural and personal partnership, some not. So those of you who do can just go back to your knitting or coffee or gin or whatever for the next few minutes, and just a bit of background. John Seeley was born, so slide please, in fact 2 slides. That's it, thank you. John Seeley, we've got the dates there, were both met as undergraduates of Trinity College, Cambridge, probably in late 1919. They'd gone up that year, John Seeley to read architecture, Paul Paget economics. Paul Paget, John Seeley was old enough to have served very briefly in the wartime army. He was about 18 months older. Paul Paget went straight from school at Winchester to university. It was actually on stage through the Amateur Dramatic Club that they met, which Paget recalled was to absorb most of my time, which should have been devoted to my studies, with predictable results. Both came from wealthy, privileged backgrounds. School at Harrow and Winchester indicates that. John Seeley's great-grandfather, Sir Charles Seeley, in the 19th century made a fortune in coal and bought the Brook estate on the Isle of Wight. And John's father was General Jack Seeley, a noted soldier and politician. Luke Paget came from an equally noted family and married into the Hoare, H-O-A-R-E, the Hoare Bank, one of the Hoare banking families. He was a bishop, as was his brother, 2 brothers who were bishops. Luke Paget, who said he had been he was devout, one of those devout sort of late Tractarian clergymen. Said he'd been happiest as a parish priest in East London among the poor. In 1919, he was translated. He served 10 years as suffragan bishop in Stepney to be diocesan of Chester. Sorry. Paul Paget wrote some autobiographical chapters which frustratingly end, or what survives ends in 1930 with the moving into 41 Cloth Fair. Well, I'm going to quote from some of those. I think there may be another bit to this slide. Do you want to click the slide? Oh, okay. So at Cambridge, they discovered they shared many of the same interests, so they decided to apply for rooms together and were allocated a wainscoted set of delightful rooms looking towards Wren's library. In fact, the colonnade of the library at Trinity College is reckoned to be mirrored within the colonnade at the entrance of Eltham. Paul Paget went down after his second year without a degree. Predictably, as I said earlier, his tutor more or less said to him, there's not much point in you coming up for a third year because you're not going to make it. John Seeley graduated in 1922. They then shared a flat together in Queen Anne's Gate Mews and lived together for the next 40 years until John Seeley's early death from lung cancer. They were known in business and generally as the partners, which is how I shall refer to them jointly when that is necessary. Their first commission, right, slide please, was restoring Mottiston Manor, Isle of Wight, for John Seeley's father, and there should be another one to come. It may just come. No, go back. It will come on automatically if it comes on at all. Just leave it. Then they registered their partnership that year with the RIBA. Bishop Paget wasn't to be done down by this army chap, so the next job was remodelling the chapel of Chester Diocesan retreat house, where of course he was bishop, which was warmly commended. This may say something about their style and who they followed. Warmly commended on by Goodhart Rendell. This was followed by a number of smaller commissions. Paul Paget put it as building a garage for an aunt and so on, which I think probably referred to Elibank on the banks of the River Tweed in southern Scotland. And there are also gates for a Canadian cemetery in Monchy-le-Preux, General Seeley having commanded a Canadian regiment, cavalry regiment. Towards the end of the 1920s, with a growing practice, it became clear that the Mews flat was not really adequate as home and office, and it might be better to look for somewhere nearer the city. So one day, quite by chance, in turning into Cloth Fair, right, slide please, there was, turning into Cloth Fair, they came across an old and dilapidated house, what had clearly been a fine old house, but was now so derelict as to be fenced off with both a for sale sign and a dangerous structure notice, into which 2 street urchins were sneaking. So intending to tell the boys how dangerous it was, they followed them in. They never found the miscreant pair, but did find a wealth of surviving historic fabric. So they approached their respective fathers for the money, and following a favourable inspection and report by Sir Bannister Fletcher, an old acquaintance of General Seeley, they were free to clinch the purchase, and so 41 Cloth Fair was bought and restored as their home and offices. In a way, that was their first 1930s project, but we'll leapfrog for that. Right, slide, please, I think. Okay, that's 41 Cloth Fair now, and again. Right, thank you. A central London base was great for business, but as Paul Paget wrote, here you are, architects must have some seclusion in which to work. It's often difficult in the office with the staff and the telephone, to say nothing of callers and correspondence making continual demands for immediate attention. So the shack or the cabin fulfills the requirements of such a retreat. And he wrote, more like a caravan without wheels than anything else. You can read this yourself. Connected to the main services, makes housekeeping a reasonably simple task even for a mere male. But he even had an ex-directory telephone. Positioned then, let's see if the next image comes up. Should be overhead. No, okay. Sorry, I'm not sure what's happening to the PowerPoint. It's not got everything on it I put on it. All right, it was positioned overlooking Freshwater Bay, which was on the Isle of Wight, which, while delightful in summer, the shack would have been exposed to the ferocity of Atlantic weather in winters. Weatherproofing, warmth, and durable construction were paramount. On the timber frame, cedarwood shingles covered roof and walls, while internally walls and ceiling, cork tile flooring, walnut woodwork, plate glass windows sliding vertically with winding gear, stainless steel flue over gas fire, chrome plated ladders to the bunks. The fittings are an expensive type, so that its total cost is very high. The cost of all builders' work, including materials, erection and all joinery fittings, was only £270. So over against Cloth Fair, it showcased their facility in modern style and using modern materials. Hitherto, much of their work had been restoring historic fabric. They risked becoming seen mainly or only for that. The previous year, they had demonstrated at St Faith's Church, which we'll come on to later, their use of reinforced concrete. Let's say that up to that point, really, much of their work had been restoration. It may seem idiosyncratic today, but the shack, as it became known, should be read against the mores of the time. Especially in the mid-1930s, there was a pattern of hot, dry summers which encouraged outdoor activities. walking holidays, camping and caravan. You're 30s people, you know all this, were popular. Increasing car ownership meant that people could get out of the spreading suburban sprawl into the countryside. So the shack fitted in with a vogue to get back to the simple life. The immense popularity of, this is Paul Paget again, the immense popularity of the hiking holiday and caravans demonstrate that the present generation is really anxious to escape at intervals from the rush and tumble of 1934. So, right, slide, please. The partners have been on the Courtaulds. Oh, right, okay. This is behaving oddly. And again, right, thank you. The partners have been on the Courtaulds yacht on the left in 1932 for part of a cruise around the west of Scotland. So they, and it's maybe, you know, the cabin of one of those made them think in terms of something like the shack. They would be familiar with the yachts of the wealthy, which congregated annually off the Isle of Wight for Cowes Week. Perhaps it was modelled on the cabin of a boat. But that takes us on to Eltham Hall, as I will generally call it, which seems to have been what it was mostly referred to at the time. Paul Paget's cousin Lewis Hoare had been at Cambridge with Stephen Courtauld, and they'd been on the Courtauld yacht, so they obviously knew them already. Stephen Courtauld said, "I want to build a house. My requirements are perfectly simple. I want to be within fairly easy reach of London theatres and concert halls, but at the same time have enough space to make an outstanding garden." But it was actually Bishop Paget who preached at Eltham. I wonder if he preached in the, I think, virtually new Cashmile Day Church at Eltham, but we'll probably never know that. He preached there and came back to say, Eltham Palace is going spare. No one can think what to do with it. So Stephen and Virginia Courtauld were invited for dinner at 41 Cloth Fair, and then taken across the road for a sort of impromptu organ recital in St Bartholomew the Great Church, and as a result landed the commission. There was evidently concern for some sort of senior guidance for the comparatively inexperienced architects, and I assume you'll probably know the Eltham story fairly well. Eltham was Crown property, considerable historical significance. The Tudor queens Mary and Elizabeth lived there as princesses following their mother's falls from favour from Henry VIII. Sir Charles Peers had recently retired as Chief Inspector of Ancient Monuments, so he was appointed in a sort of advisory or supervisory capacity to oversee particularly the restoration of the old hall and construction of the new house. So the two were very separate operations. Seeley and Paget's pre-1940 files are not known to have survived, very frustratingly. So it's difficult to assess how much the extremely wealthy Courtaulds dictated to the young architects. What has been identified, however, in an article by Laura Hulliston is the extent to which the internal design, decoration and furnishing was decided really largely by Virginia Courtauld. Let's move on the slide. I can't remember what we've got here. Oh no, we've moved on about 10. Right, and can we go to where? Right, let's stop there. So I'll read the quote. The most employed interior decorator in the house was the Italian aristocrat Peter Malcrida, who specialised in the Renaissance style. He was popular with London society as a neighbour and friend of the Courtaulds in their central London home in Grosvenor Square. Jeannie commissioned him, Jeannie being the contraction of Virginia Courtauld, commissioned him to undertake interiors there and also later at Eltham. His schemes in the house ranged from Jeannie's luxurious bathroom with gold mosaic tiles on its walls and a marble sculpture of Psyche, to the dining room with its aluminium leaf ceiling panel and pink leather upholstered furniture. The then Duchess of York, later known to many of us as the Queen Mum, commented after visiting Eltham in 1936, a rather discreet comment, I think. I must say, I thought the modern part a little overdone. Well, Paul Paget was much more acidic, I think, in the interview he gave to it's gone from me. The interview he gave in the 1930s journal, now of course the 20th Century Society, Clive Hassett, sorry, bit of amnesia there, was quite acidic. The interior decoration at Eltham was fairly odd. Malcreda was employed, and he did a very remarkable dining room, but it was not really quite our taste. It had a silver ceiling. And then later, we were allowed to do all the bedrooms. We also did the bathrooms. The only bathroom we would not do was Lady Courtaulds' bathroom, and that's where the Marchese Malcreda stepped in with, you know, some green onyx and gold-plated taps. We slightly resented that and thought we would have done something much better. The Courtaulds were clients with a very clear sense of what they wanted and a determination and money to get it. It's not unlikely they were as specific about the design and building of the house as with the interiors. Their emphasis seems to have been on having a thoroughly 1930s house in the fashionable butterfly plan, with a sizable garden. A former royal hall gave it extra kudos. Taken together, these might indicate that Seeley and Paget were to some extent caught in challenging dynamics. The restoration of as I've said, the restoration of the hall and building were apparently two separate projects with a multiplicity of contractors. Right, let's move on, see what the next slide. Right, there we've got some of the quotes I was looking for. Spend a moment just having a look at those. Should we move on again? Right, and there should be some additional pieces to this. Oh no, okay, let's just leave it there. We'll come on to Templewood. So Eltham got a bad press. A correspondence in the Times opened with a vituperative letter by the historian G.M. Young. As Eltham, in order to provide, you probably know all this, the tenant with a modern mansion, three distinguished architects, interesting, three distinguished architects, so clearly, you know, it's not just Seeley and Paget, united their taste and intelligence to destroy one of the most beautiful things in the neighbourhood of London. Knowing it to be Crown property, I'd always supposed it was out of all danger. The other day, turning aside to see it once more, I found myself confronted by what at first I took to be an admirably designed but unfortunately sited cigarette factory. Sir Herbert Baker, so Paul Paget then, in his Clear Archive Acid interview half a century later, really he put the blame on Herbert Baker, who wrote a very nice, this is what Paul Paget said, very nice letter saying he'd heard of what we were doing, could he come and see it? So we extended ourselves. I can remember a great picnic tea party in the moat garden. We thought everything was going wonderfully, and we were a little disappointed when about a week afterwards there appeared a letter in the Times over Sir Herbert Baker's signature saying romance has gone from Eltham. Well, Paul Paget was getting mixed up there. After half a century, it's hardly surprising. Baker's letter, who followed Young's letter of complaint about the famous bit about the cigarette factory. Paul Baker's letter was in fact headed the added buildings, and while sniping mainly at governmental control of historic buildings, he asked, should not architects and clients in such cases suppress on the exterior of their buildings any expression of their own individuality and so on. And then there were a couple of letters from G.M. Young deploring transient political ministers and unqualified civil servants who had allowed the destruction. And really fingers were being pointed more, I think, at the public authorities who had allowed the scheme. And I think in defence of stealing Paget, if you look at their other restorations, they were quite careful about preserving the layers of a building's past, rather than really so much that went without them. There we are. Romance Dies at Eltham was the title of a more sympathetic and balanced piece in the Architect and Building News, really reflecting the building in use is safer than a building in neglect, and many generations after us will be able to enjoy the spectacle of the roof which sheltered the revels of our Tudor kings. In other words, the romance of picturesque decay is all very well, but is the harbinger of a building's demise. So what's Eltham today is the clash of preserving an important historic building with a Jazz Age interior. Right, let's Templewood. I've got quite a bit more. Let's see how we can get through this a bit quickly. Templewood, North Norfolk, was built for Paul Paget's uncle, the diplomat Sir Samuel Hoare, and the quote you have on your screens from the Clive Asset interview says he knew exactly what he wanted, and so we designed this Norfolk manor house with curly Dutch gables, and presented it, and he said, "Oh no, that's not the sort of thing I want at all. I'll give you the 4 books of Palladio." On diplomatic missions, let's move on a slide. Let's see what we get. Okay, thank you. On diplomatic missions through the 1930s in Italy, Spain, and elsewhere, while the international crisis deepened, and he was the Hall of our pact, of course, was Sir Samuel Hoare. Sir Samuel and Lady Maud envisaged the kind of refuge they wanted to come home to in the Peace of Norfolk, and it was to be a small house on a big site. My family home had always been the opposite. I came from a very wealthy family, which had a Side-Strand Hall on the Norfolk coast. If you look in the top left, he said, as to the site, it seemed already marked out by Providence. A square of farmland in the middle of my woods formed an enclave bounded on 3 sides by belts of trees, and on the south side by a running stream. And these are all details he put in his autobiographical work, The Unbroken Thread. So the house would reference what they'd seen in France. So that's 1/2 striking my clock in the study. And then he so much for the landscape. So the house, a lot of it reflects the Petit and Grand Trianon, the two houses, and then he says there are now Russian memories, and so the house must be painted in that sort of kind of yellow, and then then in Spain, the little Spanish casitas. But also isn't here. And they said next there was our Italian chapter to make its suggestion of Palladio, the domestic architect, who combined comfort with dignity. The central feature of these country houses was the big hall that often took the form of a courtyard or patio around which the other rooms were assembled. The plan, when adapted to an English house, meant one big room in the centre. So he had a very clear idea of what he wanted. Well, put these requirements alongside incorporating Sir Samuel's architectural salvage. Let's see what's next. Oh, okay, we've skipped on. Right, skip again, go on again. What's that doing here? Oh, we've moved miles on. Well, I don't know why we've got that. Right. So, Nuttall Temple was a classical villa. Ignore what's on your screen in front of you, please. There. Nuttall Temple was a classical villa based on the rotunda, Palladio's rotunda, near near Nottingham was demolished in the 1920s, and the site is now under junction 26 of the M1. And so the big portico of Nuttall has become a loggia on the south side of the house. The ironwork, some of the most remarkable in England that have surrounded the gallery, now makes a balustrade for the flat roof, and the two bridges over the former water, the sphinxes, more French than Egyptian. The columns of the Nuttall portico were too high for our needs. Temple was a single-storey building. We had to look elsewhere and found another condemned building, Soane's Bank of England. So the rather fine Doric columns Ionic columns form the facades of Templewood. So you're not only having to combine Sir Samuel, all the bits, architectural influences that Sir Samuel's picked up on his various diplomatic missions, but also his architectural salvage, which he's had carefully in store in North Norfolk. Moreover, you know, this is Paul Paget's favourite uncle, whom closest uncle, who in the end left. They were childless and left Templewood to Paul Paget. So really, they had their arms really twisted up their backs. So what I'm saying is that these three buildings are not representative, right? It looks as if we're not going to see the churches. I'm not sure what's happened to the PowerPoint. Their first church was the one that was shown on the title page for the slides, St Faithfully on the Solent, and in many ways it set the tone that followed. Externally, I'm going to whiz through these because they're without the slides to see them, it's a little difficult. The unassuming brick exterior of St Faith's is set among trees and almost looks as if it's an agricultural building. It's being a bit rude to St Faith's, but it's got that. It's not. It belies the interior because the drama of the interior is 8 soaring concrete catenary arches are the full height of the building. They stride along its length, providing a semblance of a Gothic vault, flanked by smaller, similarly arched side aisles. It's almost as though the building is, or the architects are shy about showing the true colours to the world beyond. But in a way, with its high fenestration, it set the tone for much of what was followed. And it also, incidentally, a few years previously, Celine Paget had gone to Paris to meet Le Corbusier, who has said to them, "You don't want to have anything to do with reinforced concrete. Your vernacular architecture is timber construction." Well, they obviously went right against that. But at the same time as they were designing St Faith's, they were working on St George's 6 Mile Bottom. Paul Paget said it was lovely to have designed a house, a chapel, a church rather, at 6 Mile Bottom, between Cambridge and Newmarket. It's so difficult. If any of you know this, it's in the middle of a field just outside the village. Impossible to think they're both designed by the same architect at the same time. Literally, they were both being designed together. It's a flint and brick box of East Anglican with a rural vernacular. Inside, rather than having the drama of St Faith's, is a very austere interior, almost like a nonconformist preaching house. The majority of their work was in their work indeed in churches in southeast England, but the exception to 3 1930s churches in the north, St John's, Barrow Furness was a competition winner with an imposing colonnaded entrance, apparently modelled on a church in Nazareth, and then St Barnabas, Carlisle, both cruciform and with semicircular concrete arches, and again full height semicircular headed windows, but a higher fenestration. In the contrast, though, is the third church in the north, again white painted, but the chapel of St Bede College, Durham, now St Hilda St Bede, with a traditional collegiate layout with rows of pews facing inwards, as you would get in a say, cathedral choir, but also getting the acoustics right. One of the interesting things about Celia and Paget Church is the acoustics, which seem to work for music, but not so much for the spoken word. And then three further London churches completed before 1940: All Saints, Hounslow, the Church of the Ascension, Hanger Hill, Ealing, which is near the well, it's past the Hanger Hill estate and near Park Royal Station, which you'll know all about, and I'm looking forward to visiting tomorrow, actually. And then St John's, Tottenham, on another major arterial road. The Ascension Hanger Hill is on the North Circular, Tottenham's on the Cambridge Road, but again much more dramatic on its rising ground. The church front and side sweep upwards from the road, creating a commanding presence, while the internal concrete arch, and this is their second of their catenary arch churches, is they sort of break through the brick skin as flying buttresses. So gradually things are changing. So those are their, well, one last church before 1940 was Sir Francis, I think, Honecknowle, Plymouth, which I've not visited, and I've found very difficult, great difficulty getting pictures of it. Shows a family likeness to some of them, but is quite plain. Obviously, everything's built to a budget. Right, looking at other work, could you go back one? Let's see what we've... Oh, stay with that. We'll come to that. Aside from, I hope I haven't emailed you the wrong PowerPoint. I can't. Anyway, aside from churches, there was a range of other institutional commissions in the 1930s. Some buildings for the King's School, Canterbury, Nurses' Home on the Isle of Wight, and so on. Also a few private houses, a restored cottagey farmhouse house in Surrey, a concrete and timber gardener's cottage at Wantage, and a couple of wooden houses, a great variety. And then what you did spend time seeing was a coal office. Charrington's coal business was at a time when electricity and gas were really challenging coal as the domestic fuel. Charrington's, as an expanding coal company, really had to sell the coal, and so needed buildings which would give Charrington's a positive public image. And if any survive, I'd be interested to know. Apparently, Paul Paget said one survived in Finchley, but that was 40 years ago, and I've not found any trace of it. So no longer would a hut in the coal yard be acceptable, and so Celia and Paget designed these smart little classically themed pavilions, and I think that they're a very interesting part of their work of the 30s. But finally, to look at two other large commissions. Now, this is the Convent of the Holy Reed, Findon in Sussex, now demolished in the 1990s. I'm not particularly. If any building qualifies, Celia and Paget's buildings qualify as a misplaced but admirably designed cigarette factory. Well, this is more like it, as a sort of big factory along one of the arterial roads. This is was built for an Anglican sisterhood order in rural Sussex. built to an E plan. You've got the plain front there, but there are 3 wings coming out at the rear from what I can make of it. That I may be incorrect, so very few images, very little survives. As frequently said by buildings of this type, there was not overmuch capital available for elaborate architectural conceptions. Here, though, the stretching bond was necessitated by the use of cavity walls has been well handled, and the broken colour of the brickwork made to counteract the drawn-out effect sometimes to be noticed with this bond. Interestingly, if you look at the central portion and the far portion, there is a bit of a pitch roof around that, and these were apparently in green tiles, so that's very much a touch of 1930s style, the sort of things that I think their friend Edward Morph was fond of. But otherwise, it's a flat roof, and at the opening, the flat roof was open to those who wanted to find their way up there, and said it was a whole extent of the large building is flat roof. Gives one the feeling of being on the deck of a big liner. So I think Holyrood, Findon, sadly, or perhaps not so sadly, is no longer there to look at. But I think that's interesting in a way of to depict their style. The other building, can we go on 2 slides and see what we get? And oh, we're in Durham now. Keep going. Sorry. Right, we'll stop. That's these. I do not know what's happened with the slide. No. Oh wait, stay there. The Festival Hall in Petersfield. Petersfield had a growing. We haven't got an image at all, I'm afraid. Growing cultural life with the establishment of an artists' centre where Stanley Spencer rented a studio, an annual musical festival. By the 1930s, there was considerable need for a public hall, and money was raised, as I said, competitive tenders for the building were dispensed with, and the London architects, Messrs. Seeley and Paget, were appointed. So I'm not quite sure what that was about. Well, I have an idea, but so the go-ahead was for construction was given in October 1934. Building was opened by Lord Mottiston a year later, described as modern without affect. And this is gave me my title: modern but without affectation, or pandering to the severe and revolutionary trend in present-day architecture. So steel reinforced concrete framework allow big supporting spans, and thereby reduced wall thickness and a greater window area to be achieved. The design envisaged a possible later extension, which was built in not until 1979, further extension in 1987, and at the time of writing, a major refurbishment and reordering is projected. So while on first sight, the appeal is more subtle. The horizontality of the framework curved through the corners, sorry you don't have the pictures for this, gives a fluid continuity with wide crossbands, but is countered by the pillars which run vertically, breaking the facades. So at Petersfield, I think as much as anywhere, the new architecture which was coming from mainland Europe is being met halfway in Seeley and Paget's work. You know, form and function are at least nodding to each other. First sight, the brickwork is fairly nondescript in the architect's customary Flemish bond. In fact, the bricks are sort of variegated. It's much more interesting. So I suggest that at Petersfield and possibly at Findon, these are much more indicative of Seeley and Paget's work. They were not showpieces in the way a church or a coal office needs to be, and Eltham and Templewood were, but buildings where function trumped all else, modern but without affectation. Right, final 2 minutes, or less than that, to draw this all together. So in 1930s, Seeley and Paget were still young and inexperienced with just a clutch of buildings, mostly through family connections to their credit. By the close of the decade, they were an established and respected practice, a name to watch. Of course, the world they came back to in 1945 was very different. What do we make of their 1930s work, let alone a wider appraisal of them? They have understandably been criticised for having no particularly recognisable style. My reading of them is, in fact, that this was their strength. That was their selling point. Like most architects, what mattered was satisfied clients who had what they wanted, but on budget and on time, which would fulfil and one which would meet its purpose. 30 years ago, as you see in front of you, I joined the staff of Westminster College, Oxford. Buildings designed by Seeley and Paget in the 1950s when it moved from London. Its original Victorian Gothic buildings, a century previous, there was at some point a John Piper picture of those, were designed by the Bath architect Edward Wilson, of whose work it has been written. There's an extraordinary variety of styles, always worth looking at. An extraordinary variety of styles, always worth looking at. And I wonder whether much the same might be said of Seeley and Paget. Thank you very much. And I just apologise for some reason or other, the slides are just nothing like I intended.
Thank you, Peter. Don't worry. These things happen. I think we all really enjoyed. Can you hear me? Okay.
I can hear you. Yes.
Oh, good. Okay. I'm not quite sure. Maybe something's happening with the tech my end as well. I'm not sure. But thank you very much. I've got a couple of questions from participants, if you wouldn't mind. Jonathan has asked, what do you think has sparked the renewed interest in Seeley and Paget lately?
I'm not sure I've really got an answer to that. My field has been 18th century. I think you said at the beginning, my field has generally been 18th century culture and late and early 19th century culture, religion, and society. I've come to this because of Westminster and sort of come in halfway. But what I do think is that as we're moving away from the modernist and brutalist age, and actually some of the buildings are going, there's a greater recovery of interest in architects of architects between the early part of the 20th century and say the 1960s. I think when John Seeley died in 1963, when don't they say the year sex was invented. It's really the of the 60s revolution, and from that point on, modern architecture really just just comes in and it obliterates everything else. That I think we're now coming back more generally, and people are looking at and writing about some of these architects, and from my own point of view, I think it's just there's been a lot of serendipity of interest, and we had a conference just over a year ago, at the beginning of May, 1st of May last year, which would have been John Seeley's 125th birthday, and at the Charter House, it had an absolute full house, and it was tremendous range of interest of people who some family members who remember them, through to people who live in their buildings or work in their buildings. So I think there's it's part of a rising tide of interest in architecture at that time.
Yeah, and maybe just the general interest in the era.
There is the other thing which I have, I'm not going to go into at this point, is their personal relationship, and there's been the whole so LGBTQ agenda of outing historic figures with all the, I'm not going to go into this, but of course Seeley and Paget with their personal partnership have become have had the spotlight thrown on them in that direction.
Okay, and maybe following on from that, one more question. Can you recommend any books about Seeley and Paget? Are there any biographies? Or...
I think the answer to that is not yet.
Right.
If Alan Powers is listening, is in the audience, and as editor for the 20th Century Society on 20th Century Architects, I'm sorry I'm lagging behind in because I'm hoping that one will come out at some point.
Yeah.
The other thing is so not at the moment. They are touched on in a number of books. I mean, if anybody wants to email me, I can sort of send a bit of a reading list. But I mean, there are things like like the introduction to Elton, the little guidebook to Elton, and so on. So no, not at the moment. I mean, the other thing to mention is that there's a funded doctorate has been agreed with between English Heritage and the Oxford, the University of Oxford, and the successful candidate for that will be starting work. So I think, you know, there will be a lot more work going on with Seeley and Paget, which hopefully will lead to more published outcomes in the future.
Hmm.
So the short answer to that is not yet.
No, but looks like there's a lot of material there.
There's a huge amount of material. I've just spent since November. I've spent four periods of 2 days each at the RIBA archive outstore, going through the 292 boxes of the Seeley and Paget files from the post-war period. We do not know what happened to the pre-war files, but all the so I've been going through those, listing them, and there is a huge amount of material, and that's just one lot of files.
Okay, there's no more questions, but quite a few comments from people thanking you for the talk. So I think that's probably it for this evening. Thank you, Peter, for a really interesting talk. I'm sorry about the technical side of it this evening. Must have been a little bit stressful for you. I hope wasn't too bad. And from my point of view, the talk came across really well. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. And if anybody is interested in receiving the Seeley and Paget 6-monthly newsletter, maybe if they could email you and you can relay those to me, and I can just put people on the list.
Yeah, that would be brilliant. Okay, thank you. Okay, so if anybody at all would like to rewatch the talk from this evening, we'll send out a YouTube link in the next couple of days, also with a feedback form. We'd love to hear your constructive criticism of all our webinars, and of course it means that you'll be entered into a draw to win a free ticket for the following month's webinar. So lots of incentive to send back the feedback form. And speaking of next month's webinar, this will be on the 17th of July at 7 p.m. It will focus on the automobile mascots of René Lalique. Our speaker, Nicholas Dawes, is considered the leading expert in the US on René Lalique. So please head over to our website, book a ticket for that talk, which promises to be also very interesting. So it just remains for me again to say thank you to Peter and wish everybody a very lovely rest of the evening.